whose heartfelt "God bless you" has been your only reward. I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have. Much that you have done would seem improbable. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witness of your devotion to freedom and of your heroism. Your friend, Frederick Douglass.
General Hunter was the head of the Department of the South for the North, asked me to go with Colonel Robert Gould Shaw in the 54th Regiment up the Combahee River. I remember our mission was to take up torpedo beds, scout the land for enemy camp, and free the slaves. We freed over 750 slaves that day, and ooh, what a sight it was. First, when the slaves saw the gunboats coming, they scuttled off into the forest like scared little deer or something, and then they come a-peeping out. I yelled out, "These here is Mr. Lincoln's men, and they come to set you free." Oh, Lord, nothing in the world could stop them peoples from coming in. Even that old slave owner's whip didn't stop. Some of them old slave owners even killed some of them to keep them from running. But did they come? What a sight, what a sight. I can see them colored peoples now running down in hills and tearing up that road heading straight for the gunboats. Some of them even snatched up hot pots of rice like they come right off the fire. Had children wrapped around their necks, hanging off the backs, had pigs hanging down the backs, chickens and everything. Some folks just dropped their holes in the fields. We took all of them back to Port Royal. They was called contraband of war. I served the Union Army as a soldier, spy, scout, cook, and a nurse, doing anything I could for the cause of freedom.
Maybe the day the stars align for you. So be fearless when you walk, honest when you talk. Forces can't shake you, know how. Your swagger precedes you, so step into your light, remember who you are, battle of the sun. Let your magic shine, 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 Orekelewa. Let it shine, Orekelewa. Let it shine, Orekelewa. Let it shine, Orekelewa. Let it shine. The time has come for you to take your place. No more, so stand tall and be firm. Let your voice be heard. Babylon's got to fall now. Your ancestors demand it. Release the ball and chain. Cause no matter what they do, despite what they say, black gold always shine, shine, shine. Orekelewa. Shine, black gold always shine. Black gold got to shine. Let it shine, let it shine. Black gold shine, black gold shine. Black gold always shine, shine, shine. Do you know, perseverance is the mother of all creation? Yes, we are doing black gold. Do black gold. Black gold of the sun, shining magic, let it shine. Black gold of the sun, shining magic, let it shine. Black gold of the sun, shining magic, let it shine. Black gold of the sun, shining magic. Sun, shine your magic, let it shine. Of the sun, shine your magic, let it shine. Of the sun, shine your magic, let it shine. Of the sun, shine your magic, let it shine. Of the sun, shine your magic, let it shine. Of the sun, shine your magic, let it
So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'm Nikki Jones. I'm professor of African American Studies here at Cal. Yes, 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 yes. Okay. And as we're getting set up, I teach a class here on race and the justice system. And I was in class, we had our first class yesterday, and I have at least one student here. I told them to come, they get some extra credit along with some knowledge. And I talked to the students about the significance of these two numbers, 5 and 400, right? 5 and 400. And we are here to celebrate 400 years of resistance to slavery and injustice. We know that this month that the 5 also stands for what? Ferguson, right? And we know that the 5 matters, right? That it occurs, that it lingers because of the 400. And I'm so honored today to introduce our two panelists because it's their work, their interrogation of how the criminal justice system operates as a form of racial control and racial domination then and now that helps to illuminate this history for all of us. And it is a great, great pleasure to introduce both of them. So I'll start today with introducing Dennis Childs, an associate professor of African American literature and an affiliate faculty member of the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego. He is the author of Slaves of the State, Black Incarceration from the Chain Gang to the Penitentiary, a work that deals with the connections between chattel slavery and prison slavery from the late 19th century through the prison industrial complex. As a scholar activist, he has worked with various social justice organizations, including the Malcolm X grassroots movement, All of Us or None, Critical Resistance, and the Chicano-Mexicano Prison Project. He currently serves as faculty advisor for Students Against Mass Incarceration, a student-run prison abolitionist organization. In 2015, he was a member of the first ever prison solidarity delegation from the US to Palestine. The title of his talk today is Until Everybody's Free, Neoslavery, Neoabolition, and Prison Industrial Genocide. And we welcome Dennis. There you are. Welcome. And our next panelist, Talitha LeFlouria, is the Lisa Smith Discovery Associate Professor of African and African American Studies in the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. She is also the founding director of the Public Voices Fellowship, sponsored by the Op-Ed Project at UVA. Dr. LeFlouria is a national recognized historian and a leading expert on Black women and mass incarceration. She is the author of the I can't even list them all in the time we have, multi-award-winning Chained in Silence, Black Women and Convict Labor in the New South, the first history of Black working-class incarcerated women in the post-Civil War period. In addition to her scholarly publications, Professor LeFlouria also writes for popular media outlets, including The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The Root. Her scholarship has been featured in Ms. Magazine, Huffington Post, The Nation, For Harriet, and Colorblind Magazine. She's also made on-camera appearances on C-SPAN and in several PBS documentaries, including the award-winning Slavery by Another Name and the forthcoming Rust documentary about income inequality in Newark, New Jersey. The title of Professor LeFlouria's talk is Black Women and Mass Incarceration, Slavery's Roots and Today's Realities. And welcome.
So first, I want to thank the organizers, particularly Dr. Eula Taylor and Takia Franklin, for making this possible. Dr. Taylor is actually a long-term mentor of mine, so this is somewhat of a homecoming for me. I had the sometimes pleasure, sometimes aggravation of being a grad student here at UC Berkeley a while back. I won't say the years. And I also want to thank all the faculty, staff, students, and community members who are here today, and also want to just join everybody again in thanking that tremendous dance troupe for the performance a minute ago. I'm deeply honored to be in conversation with also such a tremendous group of scholars. Dr. LeFlouria is someone who I respect a great deal. Her work is really vitally important to my own pathway and the way that I'm thinking about my work these days and forever henceforth. The title of my talk today, Until Everybody's Free, actually stems from a speech delivered by Fannie Lou Hamer in 1971, July, at the National Women's Political Caucus in Washington, D.C., the full title of which was Nobody's Free Until Everybody's Free. And I wanted to start off with those words from that tremendous freedom fighter of ours and struggle and former prisoner herself, both as a sharecropper and in the various jails she was locked up in and tortured in, because there's a way in which, you hear the term prison abolition. I think when she said, until everybody's free, nobody's free, she wasn't speaking metaphorically. We of course, are sitting at this illustrious campus that is a part of a state that is the prison capital of the world. And in terms of the 2.3 plus million prisoners that are locked up, we know or should know the statistics, and I'm not going to belabor those today. But we had an interesting discussion earlier, and one of the things that was said, which is really important, is that we shouldn't play fast and loose with historical homologies, treating of 1619 the same as 1969 and the same as 2019. But my work and my book, Slaves of the State, is about doing something more than playing fast and loose. And the main object of that work, and the main object of my work now, which is the latter part of my title, Prison Industrial Genocide, is listening to the words of prisoners themselves. And in terms of that, I am a historian, her-storian, if you will. I think that it's interesting that institutions like this that are founded upon ostensibly the search for knowledge, largely still, even in this kind of moment where both sides of the political aisle, not the political spectrum, because there's many sides to the political spectrum that are not included in Democrat and Republican, are speaking the language of prison reform, but still within institutions like this, you would be hard-pressed to find many words and sounds of those that are being subjected to what Fannie Lou Hamer is talking about when she says, until everybody's free. With the words of people like Assata Shakur, and as she sits in revolutionary exile in Cuba right now, referring to herself as a 21st century maroon woman, and earlier as a 20th century escaped slave. She wasn't speaking metaphorically. But in order to understand that that's not metaphor, you have to do the work of reading her work. Just as a show of hands, I think I'm in the right room. How many of you have read her autobiography of Assata Shakur? Okay. And how many of you have read the words of one of her liberators, Sekou Odinga, about the action he took in freeing her? Okay, Odeya Matthews, how many know that name? Odeya Matthews was a woman trapped at Angola prison plantation, at the 18,000-acre slave plantation that has never closed for a day since it opened in the 19th century. Now, to talk about, I'm going to go ahead and flash forward. I usually do kind of like a freestyle format, so you'll have to forgive me. But I just want to flash forward since I brought Angola up. So this is a picture of Angola from 1999, okay? Not 1869 or 1769, 1999. 18,000 acres, making it bigger than the island of Manhattan, which is also the largest state prison in terms of area in the country, which probably makes it the largest state prison other than Gaza Strip in the world. So when I talk about today, until all of us are free, I just want to be clear, and also about prison abolition, I am not speaking metaphorically. So it's interesting the timing of Hamer's words, 1971, July, that is, because this is around the same time that just across this beautiful glistening bay of ours here, George Jackson, the other freedom fighter that we have to mention today, was assassinated by the state with public tax money as one of the main people in the Black Panther Party for self-defense. This is also around the same time that the Attica Rebellion happened in September of that year, which we all know Nelson Rockefeller ordered the bombing and torturing of those leading that struggle, in the words of those that were leading that struggle in the state prison in New York, to be treated as human beings, to be treated as men. So that has an echo that registers back to 3/5 and before. And that echo is what my concern is in my work, Slaves of the State, and still to this day. So Hamer's words register the degree to which the prison is the 0 degree of what, following Saidiya Hartman, we are referring today over and over again as the afterlife of slavery. In fact, when listening to the words, songs, and testimonies of prisoners, one can easily come to the conclusion that we need not use the word after at all before the words life of slavery. When one reads the words of Jackson, Shakur, Robert Hillary King as they have endured political imprisonment, or the prison blues of those such as Odeya Matthews as she sits working at a sewing machine, sewing the striped uniforms for all her fellow prisoners in the 1950s in Angola, saying, something within me that holds in the rain, something within me I cannot explain. Something within me that holds in the rain might as well be Christina Sharp's Wake. Something within me that holds in the wake, the never-ending passage, to think about Stephanie Smallwood's notion of the indefinite aspect of the middle passage. One hears that slavery never in fact died to begin with, especially in a legal sense. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. These are the words not of a ranting, raving, radical professor, but of the U.S. nation state in one of the most progressive documents in liberal legal history that has this exception clause. Many of you watched Ava DuVernay's film, but I wrote an entire chapter on the 13th Amendment in my book because it needed to be written. Because when you go and look at the congressional debates, there was a very real understanding of what that exception, that was actually a rewriting of something Thomas Jefferson did in what became the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. There was an understanding of what that exception would allow something similar going all the way back to Roman antiquity in the category of non-person described in the Latin servus pianae, the public slave. And that public slavery, that state-born neo-slavery, is something that lays at the foundations, as Talitha's work shows us, of the modernization and industrialization of the Southern system. But Angola is not the exception. The idea of slavery's exceptionalism is something that I'm taking on in my work in the book and in my new work as well. Again, California is the prison capital of the world. If it were a country, it would be ranked somewhere around 4th or 5th in the world in incarcerating human beings. It is a state system, or as Peter Tosh would have it, shitstem, that puts people, that has historically put women who happen to be pregnant in shackles during childbirth. We have a facility named CIW for women in Corona, California. Where women such as Shailene Graves were found in their cells, hung by murder by the state, de facto murder by the state, the highest suicide rate of any prison facility in the country. The same facility where until around 2000, or in the year 2005, I believe, in the early 2000s, over 100 women were submitted to forced sterilization at that facility. So these connections, not homologies, these connections between what Angela Davis calls the prison of slavery and the slavery of prison are something that we need to continue to lay our attention to. But I wanted to get to a little bit from one of our masters of letters, Toni Morrison, to signify what is, rather than a linear progressive notion of history and time and its passage, to what could be called a cyclical or concentric one. 60 million and more is the dedicational epigraph of her masterwork, Beloved. And that and more, that ellipsis that is at the head of her novel, is something that I caught on to early in my time, maybe even back when I was reading her for the upteenth time while I walked these halls here in Berkeley. That and more that Paul D. and the other 45 captives in Alfred, Georgia on a chain gang went through, this is the referent, this picture that you see here, for what he went through. Because Morrison was nothing if not a historian in her work. That box in which those 46 chain gang prisoners were buried is a representation of these mobile prisons that transported black neo-slaves from work site to work site in order to construct railroads and highways and to industrialize the New South in the image of the industrialized North. So this is not pre-modernity, this is not back then. Angola is a representation of the structure of US incarceration and its groundings in chattel slavery, not an exceptional blip on the radar screen. So to quote George Jackson, we want to hear from the prisoners themselves. and the prisoners as not just telling a story, but actually giving us a theory of what their experience is. My recall is nearly perfect. Time has faded nothing. This, just to stop there, reminds me of Baraka's notion of the changing same. Yes, there's chains, but we have a recursivity, a repetition within that, or what Du Bois called old wine in new bottles. I recall the very first kidnapped. I've lived through the passage, died on the passage, lain in the unmarked shallow graves of the millions who have fertilized the American soil with their corpses, cotton and corn growing out of my chest. Unto the 100th generation, my mind ranges back and forth through the uncounted generations, and I feel everything that they felt but double. I can't help it. There are too many things to remind me of the 23 and a half hours a day that I'm in this cell, by the way, in solitary confinement for almost 8 years before he was assassinated. Not 10 minutes pass without a reminder. In between, I'm left to speculate on what form the reminder will take. George Jackson's Soledad Brother is where this comes from. And his poetics here of living death are what lends itself to my project now. Because genocide, even if it's interesting, if you look at genocide studies as a category in places like this, slavery, that is the slavery that happened to Africans and people of African descent, is hardly mentioned, as Pedro Dagbovi talks about in his work. But we have words like Mafa within the black community, within the circle, to describe that catastrophe. So there's no need for an acknowledgement, as the panel was saying earlier, from this institution about that experience, the Mafa, or we could talk about the Nakba as well at another time. So, this notion of a time of repetition, not a progressive notion that slavery is a peculiar institution, but it is fundamental. These were not just slave ships, they were prison ships. The birth of the prison industrial complex was not in the late 1970s in my work. The birth of the prison industrial complex was in the barracoons and slave pens and slave plantations and households of people at places like New York and Angola. And the connection, in terms of the connection between racial and spatial history, can be seen in the connection between the architectonics of both systems going back and forth across time. From the moving cage of the chain gang to what prisoners call the land-based slave ships of CDCR, kind of gothically called the Department of Rehabilitation. So, Ruffin versus Commonwealth, again, not opinion and not just a feeling, but the words of the prisoners lending itself to a kind of counter-historization of legal history. Ruffin versus Commonwealth in 1871, the felon, as a consequence of his crime, not only forfeited his liberty, but all his personal rights, except those by which the law and its humanity accords to him. He is for the time being a slave of the state. He is civilite mortis, and his estate, if he has any, is treated like that of a dead man. So this category of living death, it actually cuts against the liberal humanitarian frame that will only see genocide where there's piles of corpses. But by the way, this is an advertisement that you'll see in the book when you look at it that looks like the millions of others that we've seen like this in museums and commemorations of slavery, with one distinction. It's from almost 2 years after slavery supposedly ended, with Richard Harris being sold, to quote the sheriff at the bottom of the page of the advertisement section here, to be sold as a slave, not metaphor. And this is something that is not just one instance. The entire system that followed, being built off of this idea of being able to recast chattel slavery through penal slavery, is something that, again, that the works of people like David Oshinsky, Alex Lichtenstein, Talitha LeFlouria, Angela Davis, and we could go on and on, gives us keys into. But then also making sure that we understand slavery as something more than the production of cash crops, which Angola and other prisons actually do. I had a woman come up to me at the end of a talk I gave recently, and I was talking about the companies that are invested in the prison industrial complex, including Victoria's Secret, and she said, "I can't believe you mentioned that." I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, I just called Victoria's Secret the other day to order something, and the person on the end of the other line said, 'You don't have to tell me your name.' And I said, 'Why?' And he said, 'Because I'm your brother.'" He was answering from inside of a prison, per call. But to not get it twisted, even when prisoners are doing nothing, they are doing a kind of labor for this modern system of slavery. And this kind of labor extends to what Saidiya Hartman calls the simulation of consent within the institution of slavery. And people talked about this earlier, that putting over a veneer of romance and reciprocation on top of atrocity. Here's a picture from Angola that gives us a picture of that, of the prison-sponsored rodeo that happens twice a year. I even saw someone on Melrose Avenue rocking a Angola rodeo shirt like it was a hipster thing, okay? But anybody that's watched A&E, Life Inside the Big Yard, or watched the Boondocks and seen episodes making fun of prison rape, knows that this process, slavery being much more than the production of cash crops, slavery being, according to Sylvia Wynter, about ontological subordination and the creation of a kind of supremacy around whiteness as an ontological category. The sense of being in the world produced through this reproduction of atrocity, again, the changing same. So you can get your kid a striped uniform that Odeya Matthews would have been sewing back in the 50s and put them inside of a mock prison cell. Or you can go to Attica and get a shirt that says state property from Attica, or Alcatraz, excuse me. It doesn't matter. This is what this country is founded upon. So going back to the document, the famous document that was submitted to the United Nations is the work I'm doing now. Madam Timekeeper, how much do I have now? Okay, thank you. She runs a strict show up here. Y'all ain't seeing it, but, and I ain't mad at her, because I don't want her to be mad at me. So in the latest work that I'm doing, I'm starting with a classic tale by one of the fathers of critical race theory, Derek Bell, called The Space Traders. And in that tale, how many of you, just show of hands, have read that? Okay, you undergraduates especially, and grad students in here, get to work. It's a part of a book called Faces at the Bottom of the Well by one of the progenitors, along with Kimberly Crenshaw, Cheryl Harris, and others of critical race theory. And in that text, what he does is he does a near future. He writes it in the late 80s, 1990s, a near future kind of impossible scenario where aliens land off the shore of the eastern seaboard and make an offer to the United States to basically relieve the U.S. of all of its social problems, whether economic, environmental catastrophe, through a kind of magic alien stuff. I don't know. And the only thing that they got to do in exchange in terms of this trade is give up all the black people to the ship. Now, I hate to ruin it if you haven't read it already, but you can imagine the population of the United States is really down for this idea. The majoritarian population, that is, and the power structure. The black community uprises, obviously, but to no avail. And by the end of that text, you see black people being forced in chains onto the prison ship or the alien ship, just the way they were in the 1500s and 1600s, et cetera. But in my work now, I'm reading that allegory of possible near future catastrophe and genocide is actually an allegory of the real. And the reason why that is really giving us, we're given a key by Bell, because in his brilliance, he makes the message from the aliens come in the voice and person of guess who? Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, I put the graph up earlier, who, if you look at the graph of imprisonment and its timing, the most recent manifestations of it, became president right when that graph starts to really go berserk there, okay? So Bell was not doing that accidentally. And the main people who were against, the main people who were against this offer by the aliens, actually in the story, brilliantly by Bell, he makes the main people who are against it people who are profiting off the prison industry, because they see the aliens as competitors in the market for neo-slaves. So that notion of anti-black genocide being actually not speculation, but something that was actually really a real matter, was something that came through the work of people like the Civil Rights Congress, and William Patterson in his connection with black radicals like Claudia Jones, And in 1951, they submitted this petition. And when you read the petition, which you should all do if you haven't already, what you'll notice is that most of the killings, because what it is, it takes a 5-year period, the petition, and goes through all of the reported, kind of like Ida B. Wells in the tradition of a red record, going through all the reported killings and maimings and hurt, injuries to black folks for like a 5-year period. But the overwhelming majority of those injuries and killings were committed by the police and by prison guards. But actually, there's a second volume of We Charge Genocide that most people don't know about because it wasn't published, called The Mask of Justice. And Patterson wrote the foreword to that while he sat in prison himself. Due to the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Red Scare and not giving up the people that were funding the Civil Rights Congress. And what he noticed inside, while he was inside in Connecticut, was that there was something new going on in the North, which is to say that, and talking about a changing same, there are distinctions between the new slavery and the old. And one of them is, you can see it here in these quotes, I'm not going to belabor them, from people like Barbara Ransby, James Boggs, from organizing in Detroit fame with Grace Lee Boggs. What you see in these quotes is this notion, not a notion, this political economic fact of black expendability. That once the labor that built the country was done, it was over, and there wasn't going to be an inclusion of the majority of black folks in places like UC Berkeley, then what are you gonna quote unquote do with the excess? Well, you create what Mumia Abu-Jamal calls the biggest housing project in world history, public housing project, that is. Barbara Ransby says, what do the Democrats and Republicans propose to do with these excess proletarians? The solutions advocated are alarming. Clearly, the conditions for slave labor are returning in a piece that she calls the politics of expendability. So, one more item I want to show you before I conclude is a document called We Still Charge Genocide, by a group coming out of Illinois Stateville Prison called the New African Prisoners Organization. You can go to the Freedom Archives right here in San Francisco and read a copy of this, by the way. I highly recommend anybody into historicizing or being a part of the freedom struggle support that incredible resource that we have right here across the bay. And one of the things that James Sales or Atiba Yakishana says in that document is this distinction between the earlier one. Because as William Patterson began to know that prison was going to be this form of genocide that wasn't going to be called that, it was going to be called protecting and serving, or Ice Cube has another way of saying that, but I won't do that out of decorum. The freedom, according to Shanna, the freedom allegedly given to all Africans in the U.S. by the 13th Amendment merely meant a legal doing away with individual physical control. The individual physical control of Africans by American slave owners was replaced by a collective control, controlled by the U.S. government and the U.S. imperialist state. Here's a slide showing a rally against genocide by black people at the UN in 1979, where it was revealed to the people that attended the rally, the organizers, for the first time that Assata had been liberated. And she gives a really important recorded speech that day that I don't have time to go over. This is a talk about resistance as well. And I just wanted to end with the words of some individuals who led one of the most important acts of resistance in world history relative to captivity, the hunger strike of 2013, which had over 30,000 prisoners starving themselves to get us to understand the urgency of recognizing, number one, that we're all investors in the new slavery, and number two, that we need to take responsibility for being something else. And I call that for myself being a prison abolitionist. If you're hearing these words, this is Ariba Duro, J. Hashima Denham, and Kambui Robinson, feeling death at our heels. If you're hearing these words, you can no longer claim ignorance. To stand idly by now would be complicity. A wise man once said, all that is necessary for evil men to prevail, is for good men to do nothing. We are under no illusions. The ultimate arbiter of our fate and society's fate is the people, you. You must rise up against this injustice and inhumanity. You must let the state know that substantive change at every level of society is something that the people demand. None of us are free until all of us are free. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you, Dennis, for your brilliant presentation. Dennis always brings it, like, everywhere he goes, and I always grow like 5 feet intellectually every time I'm in your presence. So I really appreciate your remarks, and look forward to talking to you more about the work you're doing. So I'm here today to talk about a silent epidemic. First of all, I don't know why my slideshow is moving so fast, but the images will just cycle throughout the presentation, so we're just gonna roll with it. But I'm here to talk about a silent epidemic, and that epidemic involves the mass incarceration of Black women. So we understand that mass incarceration is an epidemic that, disproportionately affects Black and brown people. And some of you may know that women are actually the fastest growing demographic, or the fastest growing segment of the prison and jail populations in the United States. What many people don't know is that historically and in the present, Black women still outpace other groups, and Black women are still disproportionately represented in the prison system. So I'll talk a little bit more about that history, and talk about the connections between the past and the present, because as Dennis has brilliantly laid out here, the past is the present as it pertains to this epidemic. Yeah, really. So a couple of days ago, I was on a panel with Susan Burton, who's the founder of A New Way of Life Reentry Project and author of Becoming Ms. Burton. And I listened to her as she shared stories about her experience of incarceration in a California women's prison. And let me just, put this out there. I think it's incredibly important that we privilege the voices of incarcerated people and listen to them when they describe their experiences, because if an incarcerated person or a formerly incarcerated person says that they feel like they are or was a slave, then we need to go ahead and acknowledge that and embrace that as a truth and as a fact, and not put our own, intellectual spin on a lived experience that we have not had. So I just put that out there. All right, so she, reflected on being strip searched, on being forced to perform men's labor, on having days added to her sentence if she didn't work, of being chained together with other women, and feeling like she was on a chain gang or a slave ship. I've heard similar stories from women I've interviewed for my forthcoming book, The Search for Jane Crow, Black Women in Mass Incarceration in America, which should be out next year. And these stories mirror the stories of incarcerated women I write about in Chained in Silence. The women I've spoken with can relate to being over-policed and over-incarcerated and exploited by the state. They know what it means to be violently assaulted by guards and to have their humanity opposed. They can relate to being whipped with a rawhide until the blood ran down. And it actually comes from a quote given by an observer who watched a woman in a prison camp after emancipation being brutally flogged in the presence of men, stark naked. And, I've talked to women who, have talked about experiencing similar beatings or, being abused while they were on their menses. And trigger warning, like if anybody, has any sensitivities around hearing about physical violence, sexual violence, or anything like that, I will discuss those issues. So I just want to, put that out there and be sensitive to those of you who, may want to excuse yourselves. These women have talked to me about how they can empathize, with women who, in my work, were shot by guards. Those who were crammed into sweat boxes and baked under the scorching sun, those who had their wrists mangled when threaded through a pulley, those who were mauled by whipping bosses, those who suffered fractures, broken bones, and bruised ribs, and those who were brutally raped and had their souls torn in half. I recognize more now than ever, after talking to these women, how important it is to make connections between the past and present, and to tell the history in its comprehensive form, Today, black women make up only 13% of the general female population, but represent 30% of the female prison population and 44% of the female jail population. 150 years ago, black women made up over 90% of the female prison and jail populations of the post-Civil War South. And in some states like Georgia, which is the state that I studied for my first book, Chained in Silence, black women made up 99% of the female prison and jail populations. And in its entire history, between 1868 and 1908, in the entire history of the convict lease system of Georgia, only 3 white women went to prison. And over 2,000 black women were sentenced to work on chain gangs. Black women continue to outnumber white women in rates of arrest, conviction, and incarceration by 2 to 1. During the height of the war on drugs, the rate was 6 to 1. Even with the surge of white women entering America's jails and prisons today, black women are still incarcerated at a higher rate and receive longer prison sentences for similar offenses. So, let me just be clear in stating that all women are negatively and adversely impacted by mass incarceration. But I think that we have to be very careful in focusing our attention on the opioid epidemic and this rising surge of white women in incarceration, only because black women are already suffering on the margins and their experiences have already been obscured due to the deafening defense of black manhood and the fact that, we have overemphasized the mass incarceration epidemic and its effects on black men. But let's not, shift our focus to the epidemic, the quote unquote epidemic of white women being mass incarcerated, because in the same way, that crack was treated like a quote-unquote epidemic. The opioid crisis is being, viewed as an emergency. And so let's not get caught up in the statistics and further marginalize black women and push them, into complete obscurity by centering our focus on what's happening with white women. Because black women still, the issues that have already occurred historically, the fact that black women at one point were being arrested and incarcerated like 400% during the war on drugs, and nobody paid attention, and people still are not noticing. So I just wanted to throw that out there. As I mentioned before, I'll just skip down. So to be clear, the practice of over-policing and over-punishing black women did not start in the 1960s with the war on drugs. It started in the late 1860s with the war on black freedom. And I think Dennis did a really good job of discussing that. Mass incarceration is built on the historical foundations of racism, slavery, and white supremacy. And this is a truth that we cannot afford to deny. Mass incarceration is slavery's legacy. There's a direct line that runs through plantations, prison camps, and the modern day penal system. The coffle, the chain gang, and the cell block are all linked together. This year, we're commemorating the arrival of the 20 Africans that landed in Jamestown, Virginia 400 years ago. Some historians believe that this marks the beginning of slavery in America. But what do we make of the legacy of slavery? And where do incarcerated black women fit into our discussion of that legacy? So last year, I had the privilege of serving on a task force in Sugar Land, Texas, in response to the discovery of the bodies of 95 black prisoners who were found buried in a historic cemetery on property owned by the Fort Bend Independent School District. How many of you read about that story or that case? So my role was to, and it still is, to advocate for these deceased individuals, to make sure that they are properly memorialized, and to make sure that their lives and their experiences are acknowledged. These were individuals who worked under the Texas convict lease system and died in its custody. But my most important job is to make sure that the memory of the one woman prisoner that we forget even existed, who was also buried at Sugar Land, they were not all men, there was one woman who was buried there, is not erased, and that the stories of incarcerated women are told, and that their voices are heard, even when they speak from the grave. So ever since the Sugar Land case made national headlines, namely because it involved the discovery of the first mass burial of leased prisoners in America. And what makes it so significant is the fact that, prisoners were buried where they died or decomposed into the soil. So if you were working on a railroad and you died on a railroad, you were oftentimes just buried on the side of the railroad. So there are people who are buried in golf courses, probably, people who are buried on university campuses, people who are buried, in our backyards, potentially. They're incarcerated bodies, and souls scattered all over this nation. And so this mass burial was so significant because most leased prisoners were not buried together in mass. So I've been caught up in imagining what life must have been like for the only female prisoner buried at Sugar Land. And because there are no records to point to and the details of her existence are currently unknown, I've been relying on the archive of my imagination to make meaning of her life. My curiosity demands to know the answers to these questions. Where was she born? What was her name? Had she been a slave? Because there were a lot of people who were leased in the first generation of, individuals who were leased in the convict lease system had been enslaved. Was she a wife? Was she a mother? Where had she worked? Why was she arrested? How did she arrive at Sugar Land? And what bitter realities did she face there? What were her assigned duties in the prison camp? Did she cook, clean, or cut lumber? Did she sew clothes or sew crops? How did she feel being shipwrecked in a sea of men? What did she witness? How did she suffer? Was she raped? Did she become pregnant? Did she get enough to eat? Did she give birth? How did she die? I may never know the answers to these questions, but what I do know is that the only woman at Sugar Land was not alone. At the same time that she was confined in Texas, thousands of black women were held captive in convict lease camps and chain gangs throughout the South. They were everywhere yet nowhere, hidden in mobile railroad camps, brickyards, lumber mills, mines, plantations, stockades, sweatshops, kitchens, wash houses, barns, big houses, chain gangs, infirmaries, and unmarked graves. From sunup to sundown, they worked under the sting of the lash, grading surfaces for railroads, laying tracks, mining clay, firing bricks, digging ditches, smelting iron, building roads, chopping down trees, harvesting turpentine, plowing fields, hoeing weeds, washing clothes, cooking food, and picking crops. In the course of their dizzying work routines, women prisoners also expended a fair amount of energy fighting off sexual predators and nursing their wounds. The convict lease system was adopted in all southern states after the Civil War, and it was a system that primarily affected black prisoners. Those convicted of felony offenses were forcibly leased to private companies and factories by the state for a fee. The post-Civil War South was partially rebuilt on the backs of black women, but the contributions black women made to the post-war industrial economy are frequently diminished or denied. I wrote Chained in Silence as a way to balance the male-focused, uneven rendering of the history of punishment in the United States. And in writing this book, I wanted to make working-class incarcerated black women and girls visible and legible, to document their inner lives and tell their stories. I wanted to move them from the periphery of public and intellectual conversation to the center, emphasizing the prominent role they played in rebuilding the physical and economic infrastructure of the war-torn South. Reaching to the outermost margins of history to salvage the voices of the forgotten, this was my way of reclaiming lesser-known black women whose burdens and tribulations have been left unaccounted for. So, one of the most, because I tell stories, in the book, and I think stories are a really important tool and a really important way to convey knowledge and information. So one of the most impactful and illuminating examples of the state's handling of a, quote, disposable black female body can be found in the case of Ella Gamble, and I want to share her story before I run out of time. In 1884, Gamble, a 22-year-old pregnant newlywed mother and domestic worker, was convicted of murdering her employer by poisoning him and sentenced to life imprisonment in the Georgia State Penitentiary system. From the point of her incarceration until the date of her release, she passed through 4 prison camps, a brick factory, 2 brickyards, and a plantation. Her final destination was the state prison farm, where she spent the last months of her life dying from cancer and begging to be free. And so these were some of her words, and it's very rare to actually capture, the voices of incarcerated women because they didn't leave many written records, particularly in the post-Civil War period. So I want to read her words here. Judge Turner, I do humbly beg you to please, if there is any way in this world to stop me from bleeding to death, please, for the Lord's sake, Judge, I humbly beg you to send me home to my brother so he can have me cured. And then I will return back to the farm if you will not agree to let me go. Otherwise, for Judge, I humbly beg you to please help me to save my life, for I'm bleeding days after days and nights after nights, and I cannot live long like this, O Judge. The Lord will bless you for being so kind to me. Will you, Judge, O Judge, I humbly beg you to please do something for me, for this cancer is killing me. I'm suffering and bleeding as though you was killing hogs. Have mercy, Judge, I humbly beg you to have mercy on me. So Gamble was granted executive clemency. The system had laid waste to her health, and she was no longer of profit to the state, so they let her go. So, to some extent, Gamble's poor health resulted from the heavy labor that she was forced to perform and the overall conditions that she lived in and labored under. But it also came from the injurious childbirths that she endured. When Ella Gamble came into the prison system, she had 1 child with her husband. According to census records, by the time she was released, she had given birth to 6 children, and 2 were reportedly deceased. So I was going to talk a little bit about, I'm almost at the end of my time, I'm okay? I want to talk a little bit about what I call menacing reproduction and sexual violence, because incidences of sexual violence and menacing reproduction, what Ella Gamble experienced, littered the Southern Prison Archive, and babies' footprints left no impression in the records of Georgia's penitentiary system. But I've seen multiple examples of babies being killed. Leases telling the guard on standing order, to go and drown the bastards in the river. So although pregnancies and births were meticulously registered by, prison camp doctors, the status of these babies were omitted from otherwise copious records. There are some examples of living children that have been located, but I think that infant death is extremely important to think about, because when we think about menacing reproduction today in prison and how all women are suffering and how women are given birth in cells, by themselves sometimes, how their babies are being, born, sometimes stillborn because they haven't been given proper nourishment. That whole process, and women even dying in childbirth, all of that was established, during this period. Why? Because black women's wombs lost their worth after slavery. And the state was relying on conviction as opposed to conception as the way to grow as bound labor forces. And so now, that's the only distinction between slavery, of yesterday and the slavery of today, is that black women's wombs don't have a worth, and the children that are born don't either. And so this explains why, I believe that all women in prisons all over America who are pregnant and who are suffering the collateral consequences of a system that was designed to control and punish black women's bodies and to dispose of its offspring. So, am I at the end of my time? Okay. So, I just want to say really quickly, that biological oppression was used to hinder incarcerated Black women's ability to express their rights to reproduce and to mother future citizens. Mother-child attachments were routinely severed, just as they are today, and Black children were eliminated through corporal destruction. The carceral regimes of post-war and Jim Crow Georgia especially used menacing reproduction to control and end Black lives. So I'll end with this. The undermining of Black motherhood, as I mentioned, continues in our prison system and of motherhood, period. Poor Black mothers are still having their children ripped away. Only this time it's the judges who are tearing families apart, much like slaveholders and lessees did in the past. Labor exploitation, the denial of human dignity and the right to citizenship, family separation and violent punishment define our criminal injustice system in ways that mirror slavery. As we commemorate slavery's beginnings in North America, let's be careful to acknowledge its legacies and to recognize how the racist past informs the present-day condition of those who are still in chains and wanting and waiting to be free. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Childs and Professor LeFlouria, for those powerful set of comments. I've been studying violence for 20 years now, and it still moves me. It's still not easy. So I'm going to take a moment, take a breath. Y'all can join me in that. Thank you. We will move on to the conversation. And so just a reminder, if you have your index cards, write down your questions and move them to the outside of the aisle. I didn't bring my reading glasses today. I'm gonna do my best. To both panelists, yes, okay. What can those of us who are deeply moved by the vivid portraits that you painted of historical and contemporary imprisonment do to help those in bondage?
I'll go first on that one, and I'm glad whoever asked that did. So thank you. I was a UC Berkeley graduate student when Critical Resistance started as a conference here. And that conference became a nationwide organization. But then a number of organizations have been doing the labor before then. I put up NAPO before, the New African Prison Organization. All of Us or None, California Coalition for Women Prisoners. I'm the advisor for a group at my university at UCSD called Students Against Mass Incarceration. And I really just feel, again, the last slide at the top of it before the words of the Hunger Strike Coalition was, prison abolition is not a metaphor. And we can kind of go around and round, parsing terms, but like Talitha just said, listen to the individuals who, if you will dare listen, are demanding something of us. We all, and I like the conversation earlier about not kind of partaking in the spectacle for the kind of pornographic, liberal, kind of tear-jerking. I think of, Mamie Till Mobley's use of images, and the reason why she wanted the open casket at Emmett Till's funeral. It wasn't to get white liberals to feel pity or empathy. It was to rile up the Black community and those that are working in coalition with the Black community. Hank Jones is someone who I went to Palestine with, a member of the San Francisco 8. And while we were there, he told me, he's former Black Panther Party member. He was a part of this prisoner solidarity trip that we did to Palestine. And what he said is when he saw that and when he heard of what happened to Emmett Till, it spawned his career, his lifelong struggle as a freedom fighter. And what has happened as a result of his lifelong struggle has been he has been repressed by the state over and over and over again. After being freed on a trumped-up charge of killing a police officer here in San Francisco, he was rearrested again because they supposedly found new evidence at grandfather age. But suffice it to say, what he keeps saying and what I think that anybody in the movement would say is that you can't do anything alone. And that the organizations that are working at a local level, and I know there are plenty here in the Bay Area, it's the place of struggle, but you want to make sure that it's not just a t-shirt and a slogan. And so a part of that is some of the grimy work that organizations that are just barely getting over, I remember the Prison Activist Resource Center here in Oakland and stuffing envelopes for hours and hours and hours, putting a resource packet out. And none of it is wasted labor. But there's everybody in the room, there's as many talents and more in the room as there are people here, and all of it is needed. But I think that this information, the knowledge is power, and I think that a lot of the information that is being bandied about in terms of prison reform, I ask you, would you want to reform a prison plantation? Freedom is what we need. You look at the works of people that are the legacy that we're talking about here, and the condition of possibility for that freedom is dealing with the overall structure of this society that is grounded in racial capitalist misogyny and the genocide of indigenous peoples. And until we put that to the front, then we're just going to be re-having this conversation for another 100 years. But I think, as I talk too much, organizing is the answer, and not expecting easy victories, as Amilcar Cabral would say.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Dennis just said. I also don't feel that there's any hope at all for this system, and I don't have a whole lot of faith in reform. I think that we have to work outside of the system to advance change, because the same people who created the policies can't be trusted to change them. So we have to make sure that we, apply pressure and engage in grassroots work and resistance to move that forward. And I also want to add in that there's work, that's the work that we can do to support, incarcerated people, first of all, by advocating on their behalf and fighting for them, and helping them and equipping them, to hopefully fight for themselves and to be able to tell their own stories. But I also want to say that there's work that we should be doing to support formerly incarcerated people so that they don't go back in. Because in this nation criminalizes trauma. Most people who are in prison don't belong there. And, a lot of people who have, quote unquote, committed nonviolent drug-related offenses were actually addicts who were not given the privilege of being seen as an addict. So their addictions were criminalized. And so, creating safe spaces for people when they come out and, contributing to the anti-recidivism movement is really important too. And I just want to make a little plug. So I've been working with Susan Burton and a New Way of Life Reentry project. Susan just started what's called a Safe House Network. And so she's assembled a cohort of, myself included, of individuals who are planting reentry homes for, formerly returning citizens, particularly women, throughout the country. And so it's a really great replication model that she's doing. And so if of people who have, successful reentry models that they can, apply, like helping to advance, successful reentry is also really important. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. So our next question, one of Dr. LeFlouria's slides includes the headline, "A Queer Colony of Female Convicts of Georgia. How can we better understand the intersections of gender and sexuality on the expansion of the prison system?"
So actually, that headline was referring to the queerness of having an entire prison camp of women. So there was, and I'll just say this really quickly because I don't want to take up too much time with it, but there was a man named William H. Maddox, and I believe that all oppressors should be named. William H. Maddox, who basically purchased all of the female felons in the state of Georgia in 1892, brought them to a plantation, and decided that he was going to experiment with quote-unquote reform. His idea of reform was to take them out of the men's brogans and, men's clothes, put them in striped dresses, shave their heads, and make them work as blacksmiths, lumberjacks. Some were working in the fields, some were doing domestic work, and, some were working. So it was queer because he decided, because he had been a failure, and he was a former slaveholder, and most of his slaves were women. And he was very astute at managing and controlling women. So he bought all the women, and he worked them until the Georgia State Prison Farm was established.
I'll just add, if you look at the early history from the early 20th century, what you'll find in northern prisons is that once there started to be a bit of miscegenation inside of women's facilities, you noted in the record books that the administrators started worrying about white women's contact with black women because of the black woman being a kind of corrupter of kind of the virginal sexuality of the black woman being a corrupter of white women into same-sex encounters inside the prison. So that criminalization of black women's racial subjectivity as a modality to interfere with sexual liaisons inside. I also write about in Slaves of the State the way Angola kind of performs this intersectionality that is coming out in the question. I found records and images of the Angola, for instance, minstrel troupe, and what you see there is that a lot of prisoners performed in drag, not just in blackface. And then, a lot of this work, like Talitha was saying, requires some informed historical imagination. One of the particular prisoners was a man or trans woman inside of a white household. One of the guard captains who's been there since the 19th century, and the family may still be there as far as I know, and was beaten every day by the prison plantation mistress doing the domestic labor of the household. And spoiler alert, he ends up killing the mistress of that whole household that he worked for years, or she worked for years, and putting on a nice dress that she had just purchased and escaping under cover of darkness. What I did was trace that, because she was also a performer in the minstrel troupe, as I said. I traced the performance matrix of Angola to a place called the Dewdrop Inn in New Orleans, which is also a place where someone named Princess Lavon performed in drag before they decided to take the stage name or the name Little Richard. So these intersections, in terms of, Roderick Ferguson talks about these places like, the red light districts throughout the South and North, where a lot of those who are considered to be ontologically subordinate or other or demonized for being aberrant, focalizing in one geography and not in ideologically clean ways. So it's not a story of the black community was the safe place for queer bodies. But the fact of the matter is that these spaces like the Dewdrop Inn in Angola were places where people, Chester Himes is another former prisoner who writes about these intersections, and I highly recommend anybody interested in really looking at this complex nature of these connections, read his novel that almost never was, called Yesterday Will Make You Cry, which is a novel that was destroyed in its first iteration, and it came out as Cast the First Stone, and the publishers were so upset, not about men being together sexually in the novel, but the fact that there was actually love in the intimate bonds. And Himes actually writes in his letters about how his real first love of his life was a man that he met who was a chain gang survivor inside the Ohio State Penitentiary. So this story is something that is really, really important, but again, the archive is not very forthcoming. So those of you who are doing this work, we need you to keep doing it.
To pick up on that last comment, to both panelists, how is your focus on this painful subject, this work, viewed by the academy and your peers? So you're encouraging grad students to do this work, right? And some of them, I'm sure, want to know, how are you received? And how does it matter to your work? There you go, pick up the mic.
Well, I just have to be
we love
frank.
you here, right?
So I just have to be clear. I haven't received very much pushback from my work at all. But the only pushback that I received was from white male scholars who are writing on this subject and who, basically one of whom wrote in a review that at the end of the day, LeFlouria's work is it does this and it does this and that. At the end of the day, she overstretches because none of this happened and these women did not contribute anything. So, overall, the reception has been fine, but I don't care. Because, I'm writing for a group of people who had their voices taken away, who can't speak for themselves, and I'm helping incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people who have voice to be able to use their voice, right, and to tell their own story. So I could give a crap. I really don't care. That's just...
There's not much more that can be said than that. But I will say this, without naming any names, I have this issue of the slavery prison connection is something that's difficult for a lot of scholars to grapple with. And like we said today, it's less difficult for prisoners to grapple with, which is interesting. For instance, there's those who say, well, most prisoners aren't working for Victoria's Secret or Unicor, therefore it's not slavery, or slavery isn't what we should be looking at. And I think that can only be said by someone who has not been a prisoner. Because when you talk to prisoners, or even talk to prisoners or listen to them, what you hear is this, that even if the person isn't making a commodity that's going out on the open market for Unicor or whatever, every element of the functioning of a prison and jail depends on the labor of prisoners to happen. From the cooking, to the cleaning, to the handing out of all the medication that people with mental illness that should be free in society getting that kind of care are getting. Even here in California, the two state prisons, they're right across the street from each other, a Valley State Prison for women. They're growing the food, cooking the food, administering aid, legal aid, all of it. So that's the category of labor. But then there's the unproductive category, the way black feminism helps us to understand that category of productive commodity production does not tell any part, it only tells a small portion of the story. So the sexualized labor, the phrasing that you had, the menacing of reproduction, and Dorothy Roberts' work is also really important on this. The ways in which, and what Sylvia Winter, that quote I came with earlier, is really important, that notion of the construction of white self-imagining largely based on black unfreedom and the terrorizing and menacing of black and indigenous people. That should not be a kind of provocative thing, but there is a pushback. And I think that the rush, it might be a disciplinary problem of the rush to be specific, historical, this date is different from that date. I think that the interdisciplinary nature of this gathering and this convergence could be very helpful to breathe life into some disciplines that might be a little blockheaded in understanding the reality and also the theoretical purchase of the experiential. That's a really kind of grad school sounding thing. But just to say, when you go through some shit, you know about that shit.
Okay, so I'm gonna, all right. Okay, so I have one question for each of you, for Professor LeFlouria. Your slide presentation includes one of Sandra Bland before and during her incarceration and killing. Could you speak to her case briefly for those who may not know about her case? And for Dr. Childs, mentioned the veneer of romance over atrocity. This reminded me of the veneer of criminalizing human beings as a means to justify incarceration. How do we arm ourselves to recognize these veneers? How do we have conversations with those that believe in them, that already believe in them?
So very quickly, I think most of us in here are familiar with Sandra Bland's case.
At least one person, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just very quickly, there's Sandra Bland, African-American woman driving in Texas, pulled over by a police officer. She basically asked him, what's up? Like, what do you want? Why are you bothering me? he decides, that he's going to take offense to her actually asserting her right to ask questions about why she was being pulled over. And, takes her out of the car, manhandles her, wrestles her to the ground, arrests her, takes her to jail. And 24 hours later, she comes up dead. And they claim that she hung herself in the cell. Now, I didn't talk about this, but I have seen a couple of examples of the same thing, where a person, I don't know if you've seen this in your work, Dennis, where a person was taken to jail and then the next day was found dead or found hung in their jail cell. Women, black women. Mm-hmm. So that's just a quick and short synopsis of who she was or what happened to her. And there's a great documentary on her that HBO did that if you want to know more about her, you might want to check that out.
And I would just add to that, I put up Shailene Graves earlier, light blue Graves from CIW, Corona, California Coalition for Women Prisoners, Erica Rocha's case in terms of the connection between black and brown struggle behind the walls, and these cases of suicide at that institution. And call it what you want, but I definitely call it murder by the state in both of those cases, and so do the family members, just as in the case of Sandra Bland. And in terms of the veneer, in terms of what the veneers of romance or criminalization, I really started again through reading people like Asada and also listening to Chain Gang, like the blues, the Chain Gang songs, and then reading Scenes of Subjection by Saidiya Hartman. Anybody who's interested in this subject matter and its connection to the way in which this veneer, the liberal veneers of empathy, as was stated earlier by Christina, are implanted over. I didn't put up the slide, but right next to Angola right now, there's a plantation that is a bed and breakfast, and it's advertised as like a romantic getaway. Stephen Small, professor from Berkeley, did a systematic study along with another scholar of all the former slave plantations, and the very few minuscule times the word slavery is even mentioned when you go on these tours. So what the investment is talk about, it's a way, a kind of way in terms of genocide studies of slavery denial. So you cover over its real meaning and you demonize the object of the violence, so much so that if you read the letters of Lincoln, when he sees a slave being shipped south, he sees on a ship that he's on, he sees a man that he knows that's been sold from his family singing a song, and he says, "Oh, well, how quaint that God hath shorn the wind or tempered the wind for the shorn lamb," which in his words really meant that he's so infantile in his mentality that he can't understand the degradation that he's going through. This is the great emancipator talking, okay? And that's from Hartman's work. So I highly recommend reading her. And then convergences such as this are very important for us to deconstruct and demystify this from our own minds, because we've all been programmed by these shows. How long has Cops been on the air? Right. And even shows that seem to be cutting against the grain. I mentioned the Boondocks earlier, making fun of prison rape. And so it's not only for me the category of people who are wrongly convicted, but what about the people who are quote unquote guilty? This idea of recidivism. For me, if you want to talk about recidivism, you have to talk about the recidivism of the white supremacist state, colonial state first. That makes it almost a foregone conclusion or a predictable outcome of the relationship between poverty, between homelessness, mental illness, blackness, indigeneity, all of these things. The United States is killing millions of people a year. That's not murder. But somehow when a kid in Chicago kills somebody that looks like him on a street corner, what is going on? This is just a crazed person. No. This is a lot of people in terms of genocide will talk about that being a perfect form of anti-black genocide when we do it to ourselves. And one way that we do it to ourselves with that God don't like ugly mentality coming out of certain leadership circles that, oh, well, that's what they're doing over there. Let's keep on keeping on and getting ourselves together while we leave our family members in the lurch. And everybody, every one of us has to take responsibility for that. So even the guilty are ones that we need to claim.
I
So a couple of questions that pick up on some of what you've said already. So the first is there any scholarship on the psychology or psychosis of the white mind imagining and causing these atrocities? And that kind of goes back to naming the oppressor. And so I'm curious, is there, in thinking about why the importance of naming the oppressor and kind of making that violence that seems invisible and unnamed and not attached to a name, attaching it to a name. So that, to me, kind of riffing off of that question. And then the second question is, while some may regard race as merely a proliferation of capitalism, an arbitrary category which stabilizes capitalist class structures, we're at Berkeley, y'all, how is anti-blackness a distinct force which shapes our reality? So this picks on what you were just saying, touched on anti-blackness, in tandem with capitalism. How might we imagine anti-blackness as adaptive, as evolving alongside our economic structures?
So in regards to the first question, I'm not particularly aware of, aware of any literature on that subject. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But, Christina, did you want to? Oh, white psychosis.
White psychosis.
Okay, pick it up.
There you
Haven't
go.
read it.
It's in the title.
Thank you.
It's in the title. Oh, yeah.
The black image and the white mind, Ferguson.
Okay, white image in the black, right, grad school, right?
Yeah.
So, so those are a couple of examples of works on that. I have to admit, I've been so, focused on exploring, the black experience and how black people experience trauma and violence that I haven't focused as much on, what's driving it, because I don't know if I'm fully convinced that there is. I don't know if I'm ready to say. I'm trying to be real polite. No, I don't know if I'm ready.
Tell it.
Because when we do that, I'm not ready to Dylan Ruth white supremacy. Like, I'm not willing to say that these are troubled individuals who are somehow. No, we make very subjective choices when we, express our bigotry and our prejudice and racism and whatever, ism it is. That is a subjective choice. I'm not convinced it's mental illness, so I don't read that stuff, so.
In terms of the second question, I'm glad it was asked. I feel like for me, my encounter with that, with what's really explicitly argued in that question is, was very much helped by reading Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, and and also the battles that I've heard over that book over the years, and also the way in which that book was basically invisibilized off syllabi, even in Black Studies departments when I was in them. So, but not so much anymore. And what really is the upshot of that text is the materiality of white supremacy and racism, not some kind of superstructure, epiphenomenal thing that is just a byproduct, but actually, along with Fanon and others and everything that we've been citing today, talking about how race is actually has sedimented into the very structure and white supremacy and anti-blackness of society itself. And so it can't be reduced to, well, you're just talking about class. Because if we were just talking about class, then how do you explain the statistics that Talitha was just giving about the discrepancy demographically in the prison population for women in the South after 1865? If it was just about class, then how do you explain 1 in 9 black men between the ages of 20 and 30 being incarcerated as of 2009 in the United States? Because if it was just about class, then that would be disaggregated evenly. So I think that kind of argumentation is usually by people who haven't done a lot of work or listening about these experiences that we're talking about. But again, I think the scholars that have really taken what's again explicit in the question for granted have really helped me to hone my understanding of, yes, the way in which what's called racial capitalism, the racial side isn't just about the skin tone of people we're talking about. It's about a structure And indigenous folks also will write about this in depth. A genocidal structure, I'm going to use that word again, that both indigenous genocide and the transatlantic slave trade were fundamental to, and there is no capitalism without that structure. But it's not as if those two, the two former structures that I talked about died away for capitalism to bloom. I think that those are kind of forms of social reproduction, indigenous genocide and anti-Black genocide, that continue to operate in dynamic interface with capitalist structure globally and domestically.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes, so this will be our final question, and it kind of goes back to Professor Childs, what you were saying about embracing, you described it as the guilty, right, and kind of gets us to think about what we mean by the guilty and how we can get to a more sophisticated understanding of violence. So how can we simultaneously push for full prison abolition and for accountability for atrocities like police and carceral violence and intimate partner violence perpetrated by men, including Black men, against Black people generally, and Black women and queer people more particularly?
Thank you for that question. I think that groups like Insight have been really important for me in understanding how to grapple with these issues, but also going back to groups like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and other organizations even before that. For me, it comes down to that idea of community control. And they're actually trying to even foment something like community. I mean, the block that I live in, sometimes it's hard for conversations to even occur. So the other day, I'll just give you an example. Someone dealing with mental illness, a neighbor of mine, a Filipino man, was dealing with an episode. His auntie called for help, a psychological line. They said they wouldn't come until the police came. She called the police. This was in San Diego, in East San Diego. The police arrived and murdered the man right in front of his auntie. And so here we had a situation where the auntie was in fear. The man, he's 52 years old. He was having, something was going on and was threatening her, but the only agency that was available was an agency that really, in effect, is put there to destroy that being. There was no qualms about it. One of them tased him, and the other at the same time unloaded 6 or 7 shots. My neighbor said it sounded like fireworks were going off. So, and then the idea is that, okay, we need to have a citizen board, we need to review whether the cop did what he was supposed to do, what he was trained to do, but then you talk to cops off the cuff and they'll tell you that's exactly what they're trained to do with certain bodies. So the idea is like with the education system, if we only knew, we would fix it. The system is not broken. The system is doing what a colonial slavery system designed to do. So I think that there is no magic wand, and I think that question is really important and also largely unanswerable at this point. But having an understanding that the solution is not what we have, and having open forums, community forums, and again, that gets back to that organize. And there's no easy victories, nothing easy can be done, but I think that is the main thing, having the conversation. So if somebody does, if a kid in your community commits harm, is the answer locking them up for the rest of their life, or for 15 days? Because that's what we've been fed. Well, what do we do with the rapists and the murderers? What do you do with the US nation state then? So get rid of that. We can get rid of that logic really quickly. At least that kid who may have done something considered antisocial, we can talk about what's informing that. And it's very, very systematic. But it's not to romanticize the position of someone who's done something wrong, but to really actually be real about it, what's informing it.
Well, I don't have a whole lot to add to that. I think that is a beautiful point to end on. We haven't worked out all of the, ideas around what alternatives to incarceration should be. There are some ideas around, rehabilitation instead of, sending people to prison and criminalizing trauma and addiction, creating other pathways for people to get healed and whole so that they don't see themselves on the inside of a prison.
Like a job?
Yeah, how about that? That could be a good start, right? Or maybe even getting some, mental health counseling or some, support in that area. The answers are not clear, but what we do know is that what we have does not work, and we cannot allow for a system to exist that profits off of people's pain. So.
Thank you. Thank you.